Perfect. Hi, my name is Antwaun Sargent. I'm a director at Gagosian Gallery, as well as a writer and curator. Today, I'm going to be joined by the artist Rick Lowe for this horse-run talk about his practice, and I'll introduce Rick. Rick Lowe and I will be in conversation about creativity and how creativity can empower communities to spark economic, social, and political change. Rick Lowe is celebrated for his achievements in both the arts and community space. Lowe is perhaps best known for co-founding a Houston-based project row houses and arts and cultural community development in one of the city's oldest African-American neighborhoods that provides arts education, programs, exhibition space, artist studios, gardening, mentoring, and an incubator for housing development, all while preserving the character of their area's historic shotgun houses. As an extension of his community projects, Lowe creates abstract works on paper and painting inspired by dominos, a game which he enjoys and often plays to maintain a relationship with residents of his social projects. This past summer, Lowe most recently launched the Greenwood Art Project, a public art initiative of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission that featured 28 artist-led projects throughout Tulsa, Oklahoma that commemorated and engaged residents in the history of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre through art. Additionally, Lowe launched a sister project in Chicago, Black Wall Street Journey, a multifaceted installation-based project that pays tribute to the journey of the building of Black wealth using public art to tell the stories from the journey of Black communities in Chicago and beyond. Join me in welcoming Rick Lowe.
All right.
Perfect. Hey, Rick, how are you?
Hey, Antwaun.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
I'm coming to you all the way from Iceland, so we could not be further apart at the moment.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me in this conversation. I wanted to sort of begin the conversation sort of in reverse, speaking about your painting practice. One of the things that helped me to sort of, when I'm talking to folks about your work, I always mention that the paintings, the abstract works, are a result of direct communal engagement. And I was wondering if we can sort of start there. Can you talk about how your paintings are, a result of the work that you're doing in the community?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, just from a formal standpoint, the idea of making paintings, I spent years not making paintings because I didn't feel like I had any real reason to make paintings. There wasn't anything before me, but having, this kind of challenge to make some work, and I was playing dominoes, and I started just my aesthetic sensibility. It's always there. It's in the community project, so I'm always kind of assessing things aesthetically, and as I was playing dominoes, I'm kind of looking at these patterns that the domino games are making, and I just start photographing them and that kind of stuff, and that's that whole. And as you said, dominoes is a social engagement for me, and so being there, playing dominoes, looking at these patterns and all that stuff, all of a sudden, it evolved into the paintings that I'm doing. The repetition of these patterns, but it also is tied to the social engaged work as a balancing piece. So much of my time in working on community-based projects, it's so solution driven. It's about how do you use your creativity to identify some creative ways to address problems, and that implies looking for some kind of solutions. But there's also a need for an artist to question things, and so the paintings has become a way for me to kind of flip the coin responsibility of really trying to make things happen, make things make sense, find solutions and that kind of stuff, to actually asking questions, and really just kind of creating space to go through all of that kind of stuff that I generally go through in the community engaged work, thinking about plans, how do you plan for things? How do you organize things and all of that stuff, and being able to go and use those same principles in paintings without the same level of responsibility, that has to come out of it. So it's kind of, they're kind of, two sides to the same coin. And I'm really, I was very fortunate to get to this point after doing this work for nearly 30 years, and realizing at a certain point, there's something about self, because the work is all about community and collaboration and that kind of stuff. But there's also a need that I've learned over time, that there's a need for working with yourself, and renewing yourself. And so the paintings also becomes a part of that.
What I find really interesting about what you just said, you talked about how, for, close to 3 decades, you decided to, step away from a traditional studio practice, right? And you just said you didn't have a reason to make paintings. And so now, sort of having done, the sort of community projects and continue doing the community projects, what sort of sparked you to go back into the studio and engage? Because you've also, I think, for folks who don't know, in that sort of time had moved from figuration and have an investment in figuration to an investment in abstraction. And so can you chart the journey for us and how we've sort of gotten to, series like, Black Wall Street Journey, which is up on the screen now?
Yeah, well, the figurative work was, being at the point that I am now in my life and my career, I can look back and say that, I was young and I had lots of energy. I wanted to have direct impact, and the way that I thought that I could do that was to generate images that are, reflected the things that I was concerned with, and I really, so making the images relevant to the issues that I was talking about was one part of it. But the second part of it was making the work accessible to people that I thought that the work was relevant for. And so, that kind of led me into doing more installation kinds of works that were more public. So, like this particular piece that's here. This was inside an art space, an alternative art space here in Houston. But there were other works that were like this one that's up now, was an outdoor piece in front of the convention center in which I organized a big rally protesting the Gulf War and police brutality. And so I was at that time, I was really trying to connect the work as directly as possible to the issues that were going on. But then I made a transition out of that when I was challenged about, making work that was not just representative of issues, but actually had a real change element. And that's when I kind of dipped into the Joseph Boy's idea of social sculpture. And that became the driving force for me, because it got me even closer to the issues. And it also, the social sculpture work was interesting for me because it wasn't reflective of something, it was doing something. It was something that I wanted to talk about. And it also empowered other people to be a part of it and to be engaged and active in their communities. And so all of that worked. Now, when I started to, I always had a problem though with the figurative work. The challenge for me with the figurative work, I was always concerned about who was the audience for that work. I felt very comfortable with this work when it was in the context of where this on the screen is right now, where it was a public installation that was designed for a political rally. And I think that, you know, all the people that were at that rally had some kind of deep commitment to these issues that I was representing in the work. But I had a problem though when I would do things at, there was an image that would come up at some point of an installation that was at the Contemporary Arts Museum here in Houston. And I, you know, I questioned, you know, it was about the lynching of Michael Donnell, who was lynched in 1981 or 82 in Mobile, Alabama. Yeah, this piece right here, that piece, this piece. And, you know, and I would go to that installation and I would sit and I would watch people go in and out. And I had questions about, you know, the audience, you know, I mean, is this the audience for this work, you know, in the museum context? And so often I was conflicted with that idea of how figuration worked, you know, in the art world. You know, I mean, I did not want to feel like I was exploiting issues that I was really, you know, that I know that were life and death for people, you know, I didn't want to exploit that. So when it came back to painting on the next, this time around, I was so excited that it just kind of organically, this way of working that was non-representational, but deeply connected and rooted within the experience of my thinking and how I work and how I operate as an artist. So it's not that I'm, you know, I'm shying away from those issues. It's just that it's presented in a different way. You know, it's presented in a way that is not presenting the bodies, you know, and the representation of people.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that's sort of interesting about sort of, you know, you sharing sort of some of the reasons why you wanted to also explore abstraction is that, you know, the body, the Black body, you know, in this moment, you know, I think there's questions around the sort of extent in which you can, like, what does representation means in relationship to a body, right? Or in relationship to a history, or in relationship to a space or a place, right? And how do you best represent that, right? And so, you know, it's undeniable that we're in this moment of profound exploration around rendering the Black body, right? And I think those questions are constantly being sort of asked, right, around sort of in, you know, in relationship to figuration, in relationship to abstraction. And so, you know, who is this work for? You kept saying, right? Who is this work for? What does it mean to sort of, and what does it mean to sort of have the works in someone's living room versus someone's museum, and the histories that are attached to each, right? And which sort of leads me to the sort of your foundational communal project in Houston and Houston's Third Ward. Can you talk about, because what's sort of interesting, and I spoke about it in my introduction a little bit, but it was just not sort of a place for artists, but it was also a place for folks in the community, and it was also a place to sort of try to, you know, make sure that, you know, single mothers had a place to sort of raise their kids. It was also a place for after school programs. It really was, you know, this idea that you talked about. It was a social sculpture that was working for community, right? That sort of, yes, sort of was about representation and about sort of thinking about sort of spaces that were sort of outside of museums and spaces that were sort of in the community, in direct, you know, connection to the folks that you were making the art for, right? But I was wondering, how did you sort of, thinking back to the early 90s, late 80s, how did you sort of arrive that this would be the project that would sort of help you sort of work through some of those questions that you were sort of thinking about in your studio practice? Right.
Well, you know, the one thing that I understood, and I was getting at even early on with the figurative work, and doing public installations, it was, I understood even at that point, before thinking about social sculpture and Joseph Boyd's idea around that, was just that I knew that to have impact, I had to organize. I mean, I couldn't just do it in a silo. I couldn't do it alone. And so I had to figure out ways to bring other people into the process. And so, with those early installations, I mean, I organized crews around that stuff, and, to make these things happen, to do the rallies and all that stuff. So that was integral to the work. And so, but dealing with the biggest shift from that into what brought Project Row Houses about was the idea of just allowing the idea of art be something that anybody can attach themselves to. Anybody could attach themselves to. It was almost kind of like, we always say, artists have their artistic license, to do things that other people may not do or may not be respected for, because, let the artist do the crazy stuff. Well, the point of, social sculpture is that, yes, let everybody be artists, and let everybody, do crazy stuff and bring up crazy ideas and allow that to be the basis of the project. And that was, and when I say that, it was the way that this Project Row Houses evolved was just, it was pretty magical as a social sculpture project, right? Because there was every turn we made, none of this stuff was, it wasn't like we sat down and we made a master plan on how to do this thing. No, the biggest thing that my responsibility was on this project was to listen to people's crazy ideas and try to figure out how to incorporate them as artists into this project. So one of the initial things was that I had friends that, from my earlier organizing days, the people that came to help out, and we were cleaning up the site and stuff. And a couple of my studio mates helped me renovate one of the houses because we wanted to test it, because we had contractors to come by and give estimates on renovating these 22 houses. And, and they were coming up with numbers that were way beyond anything we had, millions of dollars to renovate these little houses. And but I knew how to do a little carpentry, and my studio mates knew carpentry. So we decided to renovate one ourselves. And we renovated one and realized that it only costs us, with our volunteer labor, it only costs us less than $5,000. And so that's when we, the director of the Menil collection at the time, Paul Winkler, he was fascinated with this idea of these small houses. He had been hearing about it, and he came by, and and he became an artist in the project by just simply looking and asking the question. He said, how much did it cost you to do this house? And we told him the amount, and he said, how long did it take? And we said about 6 months, because we were working on it on the weekends. He said, well, at that rate, it'll take you about 11 years to do these 22 houses. He said, but I tell you what, why don't I give the employee, we'll come up with the money at the Menil, and we'll give the employees off 1 day a week, and we'll work on weekends, and we'll do one of the houses. And then he said, not only that, we'll challenge the Museum of Fine Arts to do it. And then all of a sudden, he conceptualized something that we call the House Challenge, that got all 22 of those houses renovated with different community groups, cultural institutions, churches, sororities, and that kind of stuff. And so it's those kind of things of allowing, just, creating a framework for people to bring their creativity into the fold, and supporting that.
And one of the things that you're sort of talking about that I want to sort of put a name on is there's this idea of participation from everybody, right? I think we talk about that in the art world. We say that artists for everybody, and then, inevitably it happens to be in this particular building with this particular history that doesn't necessarily attract everybody, or attracts a certain segment of everybody, but it's not, so you sort of, we'd like to sort of say that, but then we don't have projects that actually make us live up to that, right? And so this idea of participation, in these early projects seemed to be very key. And I was wondering if you can sort of talk about why that was a central sort of tenet for you in your social practice work.
Well, one of the things that I've learned that to me, the best work and the best way to get people engaged in participation is when they feel like they have something valuable to offer. And, and the reason that Project Row Houses worked so well was that it was of a scale for an individual like myself. I couldn't do that at all. I mean, it had so many tentacles to it. I could not do it. I didn't have the skill sets to do stuff. And the other artists that were around me, they didn't have it. So it just naturally opened it up. And so what I started to realize from that experience was that even the projects that I work on now, there are all kinds of things that I know how to do, but I generally will not do them. And I would say that I don't know how to do them because the point is not for me to do them. The point is to create something that give other people opportunities to bring their creativity into the fold. I mean, so that becomes, to me, one of the biggest challenges of doing community engaged work is our own ability to let go, our own ability to allow others, to really have a stake in it, and it's a big challenge. It's an ongoing challenge, but it's easier when you're doing things that you don't know how to do, and you have to have other people to be in the process. That makes it much easier.
You've gone on to sort of work in communities in Athens, Chicago, and Tulsa. In sort of doing those projects, what are the sort of, because each community is unique and different and have its own set of strengths and challenges, what are the sort of, for you, some of the guiding principles to sort of engaging in those communities and being an artist who are, who's from outside the community, but have something to sort of offer in those local and varied contexts?
Right. Yeah. I always find it very, first thing I think, we have to, for me, I have to find a point of humility. That's the other thing about dominoes. That's one of the domino lessons that some people in our community call it the humility table, because, you can be very skilled, whatever, but there are times when it's just not going to work, and you have to be humble enough to accept that. And so going into, different communities, it's important to kind of find that spot, where I can be vulnerable and have a sense of humility that allows me to sincerely try to find other people that can help me out, can help me understand things. And like I said, it gets easier when the further away you are from being able to control and do things. So for instance, in Athens, of course, being in a place where English is not the first language, that makes it really easier because I can't talk to people. So I have to find people that can talk to people. And so that in itself is a gateway. But I also like just, I like trying to find people in their own comfort zones, where they're doing the things that they enjoy doing. And then I try to figure out how to place myself, because that's also another way of finding some humility, because if you're going into something that other people do, you're not going to be, in the forefront and at the top of the game. And so in Greece, for instance, I would see these people across the street from Victoria Square Project, and they would be playing dominoes. And I was going, well, I know that game, I should go over. And I would go over, but they didn't speak English. And I would watch them play, and I studied enough, and I kind of realized they were playing differently than we play here in my community. And but I just go up all the time, and I would just watch and watch and watch. And they kind of knew me as this guy that just shows up and watch. And one day there were a couple of people there, not a crowd, and I asked if I could play. And then all of a sudden, I realized that most of these players that were playing were from Albania, and they all lived on the block. Then all of a sudden, you know, they became the caretakers of Victoria Square Project. One of the big challenges that we had with one of the big discussions about this project at the time was, it's in this white building here on the screen right now. The thing that was attractive about that space to me was that the big windows, it was very open space, you know, and I wanted a space where there was no division between outside and inside. I wanted people to be able to see what was happening, you know, inside, almost as a display. But most of the people there they were warning me against it, because they said, you know, you're going to have to put some kind of bars on these windows, because, you know, somebody's going to smash it. They're going to go in. They're going to, and you know, we talked about that a lot. But I was like, you know, the value of this space and the value of this project is to try to create, you know, kind of an open window of cross-cultural dialogue, and having, you know, blocking off the windows is kind of the opposite of that. And then all of a sudden, these, you know, the Albanians, they're like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We're here all the time. You know, it's okay. You know, and, you know, knock on wood, there's been no, you know, challenges to that space. And
yeah, one of the things that's super interesting about these projects is that obviously the Victoria Square project was done on the occasion of Documenta, but it's ongoing, right? Like the engagement in like you go to Houston, as I was a month or so ago or now, and Project Row Houses is still going. You know, you go to Greenwood and those projects, they continue in those communities. And so it's not about sort of an artist going and popping up somewhere for a second, and then the artist, you know, has to inevitably move on and do other work, and the project stops. It continues, which I think is one of the enduring, you know, messages of the sort of community engaged work that you do, that it continues on, that it's sustainable by the community. I wanted to sort of, I can't believe the time is sort of flying. We have 15 more minutes, and I wanted to sort of spend some time talking sort of as much as we can about the painting project, about your studio project, your studio painting practice. Sorry. And so if we can bring up Victoria Square 1, if we have that one, I want to sort of talk about how you get from sort of being in Athens on the occasion of Documenta to your work, the work that you produce from it, which is Victoria Square 1, which is the first of a series of paintings. We can also sort of talk about maybe Black Wall Street as well, if we don't have Victoria Square 1. If we just go back a slide. Okay, yeah. And so for those who don't know, I'll sort of give the 5-second version of, so Rick has been engaged in Greenwood, which is the neighborhood that was called Black Wall Street, that was in the site of the massacre in 1921. And out of sort of the engagement, community engagement that Rick has been doing there for several years, came these sort of abstract explorations of wealth and loss and community. And I was wondering, Rick, if you can sort of talk to us about how you moved from the communal projects to these canvases.
Yeah. You know, Antwaun, you know, we've talked about this a lot, you know, and I just, you know, it's so interesting. I mean, for me, all my shifts are very organic, you know, and they all like lead from one to the next, and they, you know, they come out of necessity. It's not like I was sitting around like saying one day, like, oh, I'm going to start doing paintings and I'm going to try to, you know, it wasn't that. It just kind of evolved, right? And it's all connected to this idea of long-term projects and how they sustain themselves. You know, so my interest in these in the community-based projects is to, you know, do work that that find roots. Okay, that's Victoria Square one. Yeah, do work that has some roots in the communities that they exist, that they can continue to go, that they can continue to move on. But one of the things though that I realized though, as there's Project Row Houses, there's Victoria Square Project, there's the Black Wall Street Journey, and the Greenwood Art Project that are active, alive. But there are many other projects that are not, right? They exist in a point in time and then they disappear. So one of the things that started to that I started to think about was how, doesn't matter if they are sustainable for years or a number of years or whatever, at some point, they're likely not gonna exist. So how does those projects exist? How do they live in the scope of my artistic practice? Does my artistic practice just die? When all of those works, cease to exist, which at some point, maybe they will. I'm hopeful that some will just go on and on and on. But at some point, because of the context, things change. And so when you talk to me about participating in social works, the first one in New York, I had already started to make paintings about Black Wall Street Journey, because already I was beginning to think like maybe I should commemorate this moment, in 2021 through some kind of work that will exist beyond. And so that was the beginning thinking of that. And once you invited me to the show, then I said, oh, so I could do an entire series, around this particular issue, which then led to the point of saying, well, wow, well, the paintings on some level can also serve as kind of an archival system for me to kind of, do these works that just in the title of them, and maybe bits and pieces within these paintings, whether it's 50 years, 100 years, whatever, people will see those works and be confronted with some content that relates to something that may or may no longer exist in these community-based projects. And so the Victoria Square Project, if we can get back to that image, it is, that's me just kind of trying to, think about the color that that I'm accustomed to feeling when I'm in Athens, and then embed it in that piece. Can we go back to Victoria Square Project 1? And
the painting, please.
Yeah, the painting. Yeah, embedded in that piece is four critical spots in Athens for me. It's my first trip to Athens was a year before I was invited to participate in Documented. I was there for a conference with one of the foundations there, and I thought I was going to Athens, but I was in Vulia, which is a little beach town south of Athens, and I just looked on the map and I was like, Athens is there. I want to go there. So I walked. I do these long durational walks, and it took me, 7 or so hours to get there to the center of Athens. And I made it to Syntagma Square, which was, that was my first experience with Athens. And it was a very volatile time, when I was there. And then I made it from there to kind of around this neighborhood called Exarchia. But then when I went back and I started connecting to Victoria Square, Emonia Square, and then of course the Acropolis. And so within this painting, each of those locations are represented just symbolically, and they're little collage pieces of those places that are embedded in this piece. And so, being able to kind of use the work as a way of chronicling and speaking to and calling attention to these projects that are either existing or no longer exists becomes a valuable purpose for the paintings as well.
Rick is a famous walker. Recently in London, he walked from north to south London, seeing art. And it's a way that, you've sort of explained to me, it's a way to get to know a city. And when I look at these works, you almost have the suggestion, and I use suggestion pointedly, of a real estate map or aerial map. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk about sort of the ways in which you're thinking about sort of connectivity and map making in relationship to the composition of the canvases.
Yeah. Well, the mapping thing, it came very organically. As I said, when I was, tracing the domino games, it just occurred to me that, other people would see it too. They go, oh, but these maps or whatever, and they would talk about them as maps. And then I started thinking about how it was kind of crazy that, I started making these maps without thinking about it. But then I would think back on the early days of Project Row Houses. I don't have any urban planning, any formal training in urban planning and that kind of stuff. But in the early days of Project Row Houses and thinking about land use and that kind of stuff, one of the first big displays that we had in our little community space was we just kind of called it the war room, of just all these maps of the neighborhood and trying to understand it. And I was very attracted to just the way that maps work, and the way that they look aesthetically. And so it was very, easy for me to kind of start to bring that into the aesthetics of these domino patterns. And so just there are a few little things that accentuate it, to give the composition the strength of it. But then in some of these also, as you said, Antwaun, I love walking. And a lot of times when I'm making these domino, because I'm not making actual domino drawings, I have these ways that I kind of lay out the games, imaginary games or whatever. And as you can see in this piece, a lot of those are like my walking paths, these are like the paths that we do. And what I'm always interested in about that is that one of the things that mapping and planning kind of fails to do is to really be in sync with kind of human nature, the mobility that we have as human beings. We're always, I learned this so many times working at Project Row Houses and stuff, that, you may design sidewalks going, in a certain kind of way, but when people are walking, they make paths, because they move the way that they think they should move, And so there's something that's, to me, in making these paintings and talking about mapping and movement of people, it takes into account the things that true mapping can't do. True mapping can't go into the hearts, souls, and minds of individuals and how they move around space. But I can do that, in these paintings. And but even another part of it, and another part of these paintings, and I don't think it's in any of the images that we have here, but there's also a certain way that when I cut into these domino drawings, I usually will paint them on a thing. They also come out looking like kind of a language, some kind of coded language or whatever. And so I also think so when I start working in that mode, I'm also thinking about how the mind, how mapping the mind, I'm very excited about, a piece that I'm working on now that's that is looking at the question of that this young person put before me, that got me on the road of doing social sculpture. He asked this question, if you're an artist and you're creative, why can't you create solutions? And so, that was a point that caused me to pause and to think and to go through my head and all these different things. And there was no knowledge around that, but it was lots of thoughts around it. And so I'm working on this piece that is about, this is a part of the beginning of Project Row Houses. So this is going to be one of the early Project Row Houses pieces, just about how the mind and the concept of thinking about doing something that is, poetic and symbolic, but also have a practical application. How does that work? And it's just it was complete chaos for me to think about that. But over time, it started to take shape.
One of the things that I remember us having a conversation, standing out in front of one of the row houses, and you said, almost sort of as an aside, you said, I wanted to make sure that artists had spaces to sort of have residencies, and we did that. But also, why can't art also be a place where we propose solutions for mothers who need homes, or housing, right? Like you were sort of, it was this moment where, I guess to that question, you were thinking about, does art always have to sort of hang on a wall, or can it also do something else, right? And it's and I think that sort of idea, I mean, it just sort of, to me, just stuck with me, because I was like, yeah, why can't art or artists provide, housing for folks who need in their communities? Why can't that be art, right? If we're talking about the ways in which art changed the world, right? We have to expand our notions. I wanted to get in one more question about painting, and if we can bring up the Black Wall Street painting before I sort of turn over to questions. I wanted to talk about sort of the ways in which you use collage, and the way in this particular series, you also use the paper that you're collaging to embed information. And the Black Wall Street Journey works, you're using these sort of fake $100 bills as a surface. And I was wondering if you could sort of speak to the sort of application of that material in this work, but also more broadly, the way that you sort of think about collage and painting.
Well, for me, moving into, moving from the drawing to the paintings, one of the things for me specifically, I'm very physical. I mean, I've consider myself, athletic, and I like to do things that have a physical demand. And so even with the earlier works, I mean, painting that stuff on plywood, and the physicality of having to, put those panels together. And it was like, there was a certain kind of aspect of that I like. And so when I started to do painting, I was looking for some way to engage in it in a physical way. And so instead of painting the domino patterns, I decided to just make little chips and use them as dominoes, and layer them on. And that way I could build up a surface, and as I build up the surface, I can paint in it, and I can sand it away, and I could build it up. So it's this kind of, scarred kind of thing, because I also wanted that aesthetic to speak to the roughness of this work, and the challenges around the kinds of communities that I'm interested in working in. I mean, it's not smooth, it's not clean, it's not, it's rough and rugged, and I try to, bring that into the work. And so yeah. But with the Black Wall Street Journey, and also the Victoria Square Project One, I mean, those are just opportunities for me to take bits of information, not to overload it. The point is not to make a painting about, money, it's to make a painting about, this idea of a community that's been in motion and been moving and had challenges and struggles, and hinting to what is the kind of the root element of that, and the root element of the Black Wall Street Journey has been around, economic resources. And so layering in, those little fake, $100 bills also, it gives an identity to it that connects it in a deeper way to the idea of the journey.
And it's also sort of embedded in the play with color.
Mhm.
And it's a question I did not get to, but as I sort of maybe set up I start to look over the Q&A, maybe you can talk about sort of the way that you're sort of using color to sort of signal emotion, but also just sort of the real sort of world connections that color might provoke or evoke. And I'll
Yeah.
bring up everyone's questions now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, some of the early ones in Black Wall Street Journey, many of them were very much so about kind of thinking about the land and using green as the base for that. So it's very much aerial view mapping kinds of thing, looking at it. But there were also opportunities where, like Black Wall Street Journey Manifesto 1, it went deeply into the symbolic nature of the bloodshed of that moment, and so the domino patterns are painted in red, and they're kind of sanded away and stuff, and so you get this sense of this document, if it is a document, this imaginary document, was written in blood, and that kind of stuff is very intentional. These last two pieces, 15 and 14, the other one was, they went dark. They went dark, because there's something about the night of the massacre and the journey for the people of Tulsa at that point was one that was made in the middle of the night. This particular piece in particular, that kind of reddish area is symbolically as the Greenwood neighborhood, and then the vertical one parallel to that is the railroad tracks, and that because that became very symbolic to that moment in time of Black Wall Street, the burning of Black Wall Street, because the story is that everyone there were told that they had to get to the railroad tracks and go north, and that was a pivotal part of that experience, and I wanted to be able to kind of place that in the nightness, So color becomes a big part for me of kind of, helping kind of frame, the kind of emotional thing that I'm getting at for myself in these works.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that like with abstraction, you have like to hear you sort of talk about sort of something like the color red. Also, it sort of takes me to sort of just the ground itself in Tulsa, right? The sort of red earth there, the clay. And then it also takes me to the economic policies like redlining, right? And, so it really sort of has all of these sort of, associations, not to sort of just get totally literal, but I do sort of, if you're thinking about that place and that space and that history and the weight of that history, you also sort of think about sort of things that sort of came after that sort of reinforced and reentrenched that history on a people, right? I want to turn sort of to folks' questions. The first two, I'll combine two of them. One's from Jill Madison and Permanda Jacob, and they're asking about artistic influence. And so one said, I expect that Alma Thomas would have appreciated your work. Did her path influence yours? And then the other question is the art historical references I am making while looking at your abstract works is Kurt Schritter's and also the Situationist International Group. Are these relevant to you? Are there other artists or movements that you're channeling in these works? And so that's two questions. So one is about Alma Thomas, and I guess more broadly, how are you, if at all, engaging in sort of recent art history?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's and I'll answer it just by talking about the whole of my career. It's so interesting that in the 80s, when I was making the figurative work at the time, I did not have Black or people of color as people whose work I was interested in and looking at. I mean, in the 80s, I was looking at folks like Leon Golub, Sue Coe, and these artists that were dealing with figuration around protest stuff, and I was looking at their work, and that was there were people of color and Black people that were doing work, but for some reason I had not found ways to get into that, to connect to that. And then you come forward now, and I'm amazed at how much of my influence now is they're my peers. They're Black artists or artists of color, whatever, that I have the opportunity to really I can look now through and find the influence of people like Alma Thomas, definitely one of the people that whose work I look at and I think about, and folks like Jack Whitten and Mark Bradford, Julie Moretti, even folks like Stanley Whitney was one of the people that really played a pivotal role in me, getting back into painting and feeling comfortable working in abstraction. We spent, I think probably Stanley's probably still mad at me for that long walk I put him on back when we were in Athens for Documenta. We went on a long walk and we looked at a lot of art. We looked at a lot of work, and I love the way he talks and thinks about his work. And so, it's very influential. So there are many people. And then in terms of, the social and community engaged work, I mean, there's so many things that have rolled into this idea of social practice, not, just, my sense of social sculpture, but social practice, the situation is all of these kinds of, more performative types of work has become, important in that part of my practice, for sure.
And there's a question which I find really interesting, and maybe you don't think about the work in this way, but the question is, what is the impact of the Greenwood Project? Do you think about the projects in terms of impact? And if so, to add, what does impact mean to you from a sort of artistic sort of standpoint?
Yeah. It took me a little while to understand this. Like most people, when you're engaged in something in the beginning, you get really excited about it and you're so empowered to do it. And but over time, I've realized that one of the challenges that social and community engaged art or social practice work has now is that it's attached itself to outcomes, and impact as a way of measuring the quality of the work. And I just think that, that is not, that's one of the values of social practice work, but it's not the only value, and there was a great article for the person who's asking that question. It was a great article by writer Ben Davis, who wrote for the International Socialist Review. And he did, it's called A Critique of Social Practice, I think it's called. And and to me, one of the challenges of his critique was that he critiqued it based on the impact of the work. I mean, he looked at Project Row Houses as the major example and posed the question to say, well, if Project Row Houses is supposed to be such a great social practice project, and one of the things that they proposed to address is housing issues. And he said, but the last time I checked, the city of Houston had like 30,000 homeless people, and Project Row Houses only produced at that time, under 100 units of housing. And he's like, so how is that solving the problem? So, that I thought I was happy that he made that critique, because it really challenged the community of social practice artists to really think about the value of their work not being the same as like a homeless developer. It's not the same. There's a different, and that's a whole nother story to be in conversation about that. I love to have that conversation, but we don't have time now. But we have to really, accept and really strive for impact, for sure, but not have that be the only thing that the work is valued for.
Yeah, I mean, not the only thing. I just want to say really quickly, and I want to get to a few more questions, but also it's not a replacement for federal government or state government or local government doing what they should be doing in providing a social safety net for people to live with dignity. Right. And so I think that like, that's the other part of it. It's that like, like these projects are models, these projects are sort of ways to sort of think, but they're not ever replacements for what we should be demanding of our local, state, and federal governments and the politicians that we elect to sort of represent us. There's a few more questions. One from Reese. Hey, Reese, who we know from London. Yeah, Rick knows. Can you speak about your studio practice? How about this? How do you start a painting? And does your research lead you to canvas or the other way around? Or can you just talk sort of briefly about maybe the beginning of a project? How do you know, you've worked on so many different things in so many different communities, how do you know that what you want to sort of put down on canvas and bring into the studio practice? And so how does that begin? How does that process begin for you?
Yeah. Well, once again, I keep saying this over and over in this studio. I mean, I work very organic, and I sit around and I just kind of think, okay, what canvases do I have available? What's right here for me now? And I'll think about that. And then I'll start thinking, what are the things that are on my mind? What do I really, and sometimes I'll have specific things like that piece, the Black Wall Street Journey piece, the last one I talked about with the tracks in it. I mean, I had a very specific thing, and I went to Google and I looked at the maps of that whole, the Greenwood area, just to kind of help me refresh myself on the context of that, so I can have some relevance to that site in reality. But other times, I will just start. I will say, let's just put down a game. Let me put down the first game. And then I'll put the next, and then I start reading the patterns and the flow, the movement of the patterns, which will then kind of start to take shape. And it'll start to speak to me. The color too, color, I will start with a, just whatever color of paint I have the most of to get me a background, color. And I would read that and see where that takes me, it could be red, blue, whatever. It just starts with that, it's just just finding a point of departure. Yeah.
Let's ask, we have two more questions. I hope it's okay. I know folks have other things to do, but I'm going to sort of go through the two questions, and I will thank you in advance for those who can't stay into the end for joining us this afternoon. This is from Celine Mullen. Perhaps a bigger question I have is, how in the present may an artist activate themselves in a way that encourages web ties? I guess sort of on the internet, I imagine, web ties. The ability to bridge the gap from concept to actuality. I understand the possibility is there, but the retention of participation. I'm not sort of sure. Sonny, if you can clarify what you mean in the chat, if you're still here, please let us know. We'll come back to it. The other question is from Diallo, Simon Point, who is who's newly to our team, Rick. And so I'm glad that he's here and he's participating. He says, Mr. Lowe, you spoke earlier about being particular about your audience and conscious of who had access to your works and how one might internalize your images. How do you wrestle with that in your pieces of abstraction? So to sort of, I guess to add, are in moving into abstraction, have the concerns that you had early on with figuration, has abstraction been a way to address your unease or the sort of problems that sort of came up with sort of figuration and the ways in which the body is rendered?
Yeah, no, I mean, the abstraction is it completely freed me. I mean, it was a very freeing act to be able to, to make work that that has, symbolic roots, into these community experiences, but it's not talking directly about the specific challenges of lives of people that maybe the audience has no connection to. I mean, it's not a work about, specific kinds of, of people or things that are happening in communities. It's much broader and much general. And to be honest, I think it's very important that, folks from all walks of life have on their mind and have in their consciousness about these projects that I've been working on, and the issues that come up in the paintings, about, land use, as you said, redlining and distribution of resources and all those kinds of things are things that needs to be on the minds of everyone. So working in abstraction at this point has been a way for me to be free, to be as inclusive of anybody who wants to engage with them, the same as the community-based projects. Mm-hmm. So the community-based projects also was set up that way too, that anybody could be engaged in a community-based project that I'm working on. I mean, of course, there's an order of participation, but yes, from the highest funder to the person on the ground who is, a recipient to it, and everybody in between, all, are sought after to be engaged in these community-based projects.
Mm-hmm. And the last question is, we'll just sort of keep it broad. Do you have any advice for younger artists?
Well,
what's one piece of advice you wish you knew when you were young and you were starting out and you were pursuing this idea of artist?
Yeah. Well, the one thing I will say is that, it's kind of, trivial, but, it is the thing is follow the passion, really, follow what you're really passionate about and do that, and, it may be the end thing. It may not be the end thing, but, that I think is the main thing though, for artists to do is to really, to follow the thing that drives them. And, but, things that I might have done a little differently, and this is just a challenge in life, for me in general, right? Is how do you handle multiple things? I think people are much better at it now than we used to be. It used to be like, if you're a painter, you paint. You don't do sculpture. If you're a sculptor, you sculpt. You do. You don't mix. I think things are a lot more fluid now. People kind of move across mediums, but even in the broader sense, like for me, to engage in social sculpture, social practice or whatever, I think back on it and I think, I might have cheated myself a bit by not allowing myself to continue to practice in other ways, mm-hmm. And I say that as something that, with a little reflection, but I also understand though that, Project Warehouses was a beast to get off the ground, and I just can't imagine that there would have been another way for me to to find the emotional, intellectual, and physical capacity to do other work while I was doing that at that time. Whereas now, I am able to work on, the Black Wall Street journey, and do paintings and do other kinds of things, and do them all together and feel very comfortable with that.
And, to that extent, I wanted to sort of thank you so much for your time, thank the museum for having us virtually. Hopefully sometime in the future, we can all get together in Washington. I wanted to thank everyone who joined us today. And for those who asked questions, they were thoughtful and truly appreciative. Rick, I will see you, I'm sure, soon in the world. And again, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Antwaun. And don't freeze in Iceland.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've been bundling up, so I'll continue to do that, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye.